Grim tale. Will went over to the Bluett home on Good Friday of Easter weekend. The home was stunning. It sat on a green belt in the downtown of Toronto. It had been passed through 4 generations of Bluetts, beginning with Percy's maternal great-grandmother getting it from her mother. Percy knew that the home was her birthright, and that she would continue the family tradition, and the Bluetts would continue to map the rings of their family tree through the home. Percy gave Will the tour. There were 14 rooms. She showed him where her mother slept as a child, her grandmother. She showed him the box behind the furnace in the old and unfinished basement, full of dolls from years and years of Bluett girls in the home. There had not been a son born to a Bluett woman in 4 generations, and there had not been more than 1 child for each generation of the last 4 generations. Percy told him all this beside the furnace, under a bare 60-watt bulb. "That's kind of odd," Will said. "Mental health is the newest mutation," Percy said. "When you're raised in an experiment, you want to conduct them for the rest of your life." She turned off the light and they went back up the creaky wooden steps. Percy's mother could be heard in the kitchen. She sensed their proximity and yelled, "Red wine!" "Please, Mother," Percy said back. Will leaned in close to her ear as they walked towards the kitchen. "I don't drink," he said. "You do tonight," she said back, and she caught his eyes to underscore the importance of what she had said. "Mother abhors abstainers," she whispered in a barely audible voice as they padded into the kitchen on their stockinged feet. "Ah, there you are," Dr. Irene Bluett said as she spun around. Will had not gotten used to her appearance yet. She was frightfully fat, a jolly round person with huge hanging breasts that she refused to load into a bra, allowing them instead to flow freely with her fat under her loose-fitting cotton tarp. If that was not enough, she had absolutely no neck. Well, in fairness, he thought as he took his second look there in the kitchen, she had many necks, but they folded one atop the other so that it looked like a column of fat from her chin to her chest. She had at least 6 sets of wooden beads on, and those were only the ones Will could count. She had this ridiculous red lipstick on that was so glossy her lips looked like they were soaked in saliva all the time. She wore bottle-cap glasses that were so thick you couldn't really see her eyes. Just a representation of her eyes, magnified and distorted. And then there was the hair. It was a salt and pepper afro that puffed out about 5 inches. And to make matters more complicated, she was clearly stoned. Will could see the same glossy look to her eyes that Paddy had when he was high, which was most of the time. She looked completely insane. They lived well, he noted. No complaint could be made for comfort. The dining room table was a solid oak antique. The end tables in the sitting room were gorgeous. Most of the furniture was part of the house's history, part of its dowry. There was only original artwork on the walls, well framed and lit, no prints. The renovations on the house probably cost more than most people spent on their first homes. She must have had a good accountant, he thought. "Here you each are," she said, her hands outstretched with 2 glasses of wine. Will and Percy took their wine. They all sat down in the living room, as Percy's mother had informed them that dinner would be a few more minutes, and that they should use the time to get better acquainted. "Now, William, is it William or Bill or—" "Will," Percy said. "He goes by Will, Mother." "Will it is, then. Now, Will, what is this little bit of intelligence Percy has brought to me? You're working on a new economic system?" "Oh, no, nothing like that," Will said. "I just talk about economics a lot because it's the only thing I really know anything about." "I see," Dr. Bluett said. She reached over and opened the drawer to a small end table beside her armchair. She pulled out a joint and lit it. "Oh, Christ, Mother," Percy said. "What?" she bellowed. "It's practically legal." Percy marched out of the living room and into the kitchen, responding to a timer on the stove. She called from the kitchen. "Dinner will be served in 3 minutes." Dr. Bluett passed the joint over to Will. He had never smoked marijuana, but, with Percy in the kitchen, and therefore no direction, he fell to the first rule, which seemed to be, do what Mother does, and so he took the joint and inhaled deeply. He coughed violently and gulped down his wine when his breath returned to him. His throat felt as dry and parched as sandpaper. Dr. Bluett promptly filled his wine glass. She nodded and pointed to the joint. "Again," she said, and so he did. He took another deep haul off the joint and coughed again, and he gulped down his second glass of wine when his breath returned. Dr. Bluett filled his glass a third time. She stood and went into the kitchen. Percy returned. He saw her standing over him as a kind of mirage. He couldn't quite get a bead on her. Her face came close to his, and he heard her whisper in his ear, "Be careful, she's dangerous." "What?" Will said. "Mother's like a Grimm's fairy tale. She sort of sneaks up on you." Percy took his hand and helped him stand up. Once standing, he took a deep breath and everything came into focus. They walked into the dining room where Mother was laying out the plates. The table had a beautiful glazed ham on it, mashed potatoes, corn, fresh rolls, butter, and 2 bottles of red wine. "Grace?" Dr. Bluett said, and she looked at Will. "I've never known it," Will said. "No," Dr. Bluett said. "Grace, would you please say grace?" "Oh," Will said. And he took the stone doctor's outstretched hand into his own as a symbol of love and trust. And he took Percy's outstretched hand as well. And into the circle of love and fellowship they formed, he said, "Thank you, God, for this meal and for this moment." And then he released their hands. They ate their food and made small talk. Dr. Bluett inquired about Percy's matriculation, her professors, her thesis advisor, her timeline, and Mrs. Rubini. Percy was still traumatized by the shock therapy applied to the old woman. Her mother was trying to convince her that she did nothing wrong, that she was part of a process, that she had made her observations in good faith, and that those observations became part of an overall picture of the patient, and that shock therapy had been decided upon and therefore executed. Percy's meandering attachment was pointless, masochistic, and self-indulgent. Will felt like he was underwater. He found it difficult to draw anything into focus. He heard the noise made by the silverware touching the plates, and he could hear their voices like bright fish swimming past him under the water. But he found it difficult to make sense of anything. He ate some food and it leveled him off a bit. "Don't you agree, Will?" Dr. Bluett asked, her head spinning around to face him on the column of fat that obfuscated her neck. "About the electric shock therapy," he said. "Yes," Dr. Bluett said. "I don't know," Will said. "I've never shocked anybody." "Well then, just as a mental health practitioner, do you think she should be this attached to a patient?" "It's her first?" Will asked. "Yes," Percy interjected, overjoyed by Will's ever so subtle support. "Well, if she doesn't feel what the patient feels, how is she ever going to be a good doctor?" Dr. Bluett moved her head in a manner suggestive of thought, her eyes cast up to the ceiling of the dining room. "Okay," she said, "okay." They were pretty much finished with the main course. Dr. Bluett and Percy cleared the table and brought out coffee and digestive biscuits. The half-smoked joint was in an ashtray Dr. Bluett had placed on the dining room table. Dr. Bluett lit it and sipped her coffee. She passed it to Will. He took another haul off of it. "You smoke marijuana?" Percy said. "No," Will answered, and he took another haul off the joint before passing it back to Dr. Bluett. "Oh, Jesus, he'll be fine," Dr. Bluett said. "It's just weed." Dr. Bluett looked at Will and smiled. He smiled back. "Do you practice any faith, Will?" she asked. "Pardon?" Will said. "Easter. Do you practice any faith?" "Ah, the resurrection," Will said. "Powerful story." His head tilted a little. He was clearly without his full faculties. "I take it you're a believer," Dr. Bluett said. "Believe? What's to believe?" Will said. "I resurrected a guy in the middle of February." Dr. Bluett filled their wine glasses again. "I see. So what do you do, Will?" Dr. Bluett asked. "What do you mean?" Will asked. "I mean day by day. How do you live? Do you work?" I started a small import and export business with a partner, and there's a pretty good return in it. So I'm okay for rent and stuff, and it keeps me pretty well occupied, so I don't have any complaints." "Well, where do you import from?" Dr. Bluett asked. "Ontario," Will said. Dr. Bluett looked puzzled for a moment. "Well, that's not really importing, is it?" she said. "There aren't any foreign regulations. It isn't even interprovincial trade." "I guess," Will said. "Percy told me you had a degree in economics." "I do." "Would it be a commodity then?" Dr. Bluett laughed. "My God, you're not a fur trader, are you?" "No furs," Will said. "Well, what then?" "Mother," Percy said. "I'm not allowed to ask." "It's fine," Will said. "I'm buying the future of our species. I'm buying oxygen from the rainforest." "Well, how do you buy oxygen?" Dr. Bluett asked. "You don't," Will said. "You buy land that produces oxygen and sell carbon bonds." "That's got to be the most cynical thing I've ever heard," Dr. Bluett said. "Running electricity through people's brains is cynical. I'm a realist like Linus. You're a dreamer like Charlie Brown." Dr. Bluett looked at Percy. People usually didn't speak to her in that way, but Will was drunk and stoned. "I have some work to do," Dr. Bluett said, and she started to get up from the table. "Christ was kind of a flake, though, don't you think?" Will said. "Excuse me?" Dr. Bluett said. "Oh, come on, I mean, this Son of God thing. That's a little extreme, don't you think?" "Well, what do you mean?" Dr. Bluett leaned into the table. Her eyes were intense and crazy looking. "Why would the Son of God speak to a bunch of sheep herders and fishermen, basically Indians, in the Middle East?" "Indians?" Percy said. "Yes, Indians. And I've just sort of come to the conclusion that he was a flake." "A flake?" Dr. Bluett said. "Yes, a flake," Will said. "I mean, his intentions were good. The love stuff is good and true, and he's one of the most decent human beings I've ever read about. But the marketing is all wrong. I think our whole thing went wrong with that one phrase, Son of God. I mean, what must it be like to be a Jew, a Muslim, a Taoist, or whatever else, and come into contact with this idea of a biological progeny of God? It's ludicrous, and for that matter, if he knew everything, then why didn't he know that his actions would cause way more harm than good? All the wars, the death, the carnage, he's responsible for a lot of it." "Young man," Dr. Bluett said, but she was cut off by Will, who was caught up in the moment. "And if he knew his actions would lead to his death, then he was suicidal, a maniac, a flake. Would you shock him too? What would his diagnosis be in this time and place? Hypocrites, the lot of you." Dr. Bluett was red in the face. "It was his mission!" she screamed. Will let his head fall softly to the table. He closed his eyes. Persephone started to cry. "What's the matter, honey?" Dr. Bluett asked. She sobbed and said, "I'm pregnant." "I didn't do it," Will said, his head popping up for a moment with his eyes still shut. "Oh, for Christ's sake," Dr. Bluett said. That was the last thing Will remembered before passing out. When he awoke 15 minutes later, Percy and her mother were above him. He was lying on the dining room floor. Dr. Bluett was prepping a needle. Will turned his head to the side and vomited on the Persian rug. "Where's the bathroom?" he said. Percy helped him up and took him to the downstairs bathroom. He emptied his stomach into the toilet. He hadn't drank or smoked much, but he had never smoked marijuana before, and he rarely drank a lot of red wine. He came out of the bathroom a few minutes later, and he was alone. He could hear Percy and her mother talking down the hall. He slipped his boots and jacket on and left through the side door. When he got outside, he was completely disoriented. He turned the wrong way and ended up stomping through the snow and slush in the backyard. Percy saw him first. "Oh my God," she said. "He's going into the woods." Dr. Bluett ran to the front of the house and put on her boots and winter jacket, and she took off after Will. The snow was deep in some parts, and Will sank in up to his waist, but he managed to get through it and took refuge at the base of a large oak tree. It was a full moon, and the barren branches of the trees sang a soft sound with the wind that pushed through the ravine. His breathing was heavy. He heard his name in the wind, and it chilled him to his bones. He thought he had gone completely mad until he saw the immense figure of Dr. Bluett coming down the side of the ravine, sinking in the deep snow as he had, a big parka on her big body, the hood pulled up and tightened around her face like an Inuit hunter. "William!" she called. He got up and started to run again. He had the simple and childlike fear of a Grimm's fairy tale in him. He ran and he ran. He stopped only a couple of times to dry heave. He'd already vacated his stomach in the Bluett house. It took more than an hour for him to find a road, and from there he found a main road, then hailed a cab and went home. When he opened the door to Mrs. Duncan's rooming house, he was still drunk and stoned. His pant legs were wet from the snow, and his face had scratches from the branches that had snapped across his cheeks and brow as he ran through the woods, Dr. Bluett on his trail. Cobb was in the third-floor kitchen, building another bomb, this one with gasoline and frozen orange juice. He stopped his work when he saw Will sulk past the kitchen on his way to his attic bedroom. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked. "I went to see a doctor," Will said, and he went up the stairs to the attic and shut the door behind him. End of chapter.